Morning class. Today we're going to go over the Age of Absolutism. This is an introductory lesson for this unit, so we're just kind of going to get into some of the very basics and then talk about some of the things we're going to get into in this unit. This is Unit 4, the Age of Absolutism. So, a quick recap from Unit 3. I'm not going to get into that, but we will start talking about the Age of Absolutism. So, what is the Age of Absolutism? The Age of Absolutism runs from roughly 1600 to 1800, and again, this is not an exact timeline. Like everything we talk about in class, these things don't generally have an exact start date or an exact end date. These are things that happen over time. You know, we're going to be talking about some monarchies that have complete control. That's kind of where the absolutism idea comes from. But it had taken time to get to that point. It did not start out like that. Somebody didn't just wake up and say, hey, let's do it like this. These are things that kind of develop over time, but the time period we're going to look at, again, is 1600s to 1800s. So we're kind of during and after the Age of Exploration, after the Renaissance, somewhat concurrent with the Gunpowder Empires. We'll actually talk about some people who are interacting with the Gunpowder Empires from this time period. And really what we're focusing on is that at this time in Europe, monarchs are beginning to consolidate their power and disenfranchise those who would stand in their way. So in other words, they're trying to control as much as they can within their country and cut out some of the other groups that would normally have had some say in the running of the country. For example, people like the nobles and nobility, and that includes lords. Lords and nobles kind of go together. Parliaments are a big one. We'll talk about in France what's called the Estates General. That's very similar to Parliament. And really just anybody who tries to have a say in the running of the state is going to be disenfranchised or cut off, and the ruler or the monarch is going to be the one who makes as many decisions as possible. So we're going to look at several kings in Europe, as well as during the same time period, some developments in Japan that are very similar in many ways as they work to take total control. And the key ideas about absolutism are where you have absolute monarchs, right? So kings, queens, emperors. There are many names for it. There's not like a single name that determines an absolute monarch. But whatever a different country calls something, right? So, for example, in England, they're called the king. In Russia, they're going to be called the czar. And in Japan, they're going to be called the shogun. But the idea is the same, is that they have absolute power. Now, one of the key beliefs behind, or key kind of driving forces behind this, is the idea of divine right. Divine right is a key word for this, or a key phrase for this unit, especially in Europe. These rulers believed that they had the right to rule because God had chosen them to rule, right? As in, God put me in place to be the king because he wanted me to be the king. If he wanted you to be the king, you would be the king. But God has given me the right, the privilege, to do whatever I feel is correct. And because God has my back, it must be correct, right? If you question my authority, you're actually questioning God's authority. So, absolute monarch does not have to follow the rules or laws and can do as they like, whenever they like. These rulers like to take control of their country, determining who they'll go to war with, what taxes are going to be raised, what religion you can follow. All of these things, they want to have their hands in as much as they can, controlling the culture, controlling the economies, controlling the religion. They're trying to say that God has chosen me to be in power, and therefore I will do everything. So, one of the questions that we talked about is, how does this image show the idea of divine right? And so looking at this image, this is a picture of Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King. He was the King of France, and is one of the best examples of an absolute monarch. You can see how he is apart from the rest of these people in the back, right? He is kind of a leader, and he is having a crown laid atop his head by an angel. This really is very simply showing divine right, that I have been put, or in this case, he has been put in charge because God has chosen him. And that's shown by the angel dropping this crown upon him. You can see how majestic he looks, kind of the power behind how he is sitting on the horse, and the stance of the horse. This idea that God has chosen him because he is a leader amongst all the rest of these people is a good thought to have. So, some absolute rulers that you might think of. I asked people to share their thoughts when we went through this in class, but a lot of people were saying things like Vladimir Putin, Joseph Stalin, Kim Il-jung, Kim Jong-un, Julius Caesar, There have been a lot of people who tried to take absolute power in their country. A lot of times we might associate that with the word dictator or dictatorships. And that, of course, we get into people like Hitler as well. But for the most part, we do tend to think of them as solely being bad. I would argue that we'll talk about some people in this unit who were absolute rulers who did do a good job, but I think the vast majority are kind of remembered in history as being not the best people. So one of the key questions I like to think about when we get into this topic is not if it's good to have a single person in charge, it's when is it good to have a single person in charge. Obviously, we live in America or in the United States, and we do not like the idea of a single person determining everything. But I would argue that there are times where it seems appropriate to do so. And so I think we'll kind of get into a couple different situations where that makes sense during this unit. A question that we might talk about in class is what limits should be placed on a ruler? How do you keep a ruler in check? A lot of people are suggesting things like checks and balances, or the three branches of government similar to what we have, Parliament or Congress, or like in France they have the Estates General. Basically having a counterbalance, another group of people who are determining what the king does, if it's good or bad, or can we block it or stop it from happening. A lot of people think that there should be term limits on rulers, things like that. Rulers should be voted in and could be voted out. There just needs to be some kind of checks on the rulers. A lot of people think that another kind of governing body is a good idea. We will talk about France and absolute rulers in France. There are two that we'll talk about: Henry IV, which is this gentleman right here, and Louis XIV, who we saw just a moment ago. We will talk a little bit about Russian rulers. We'll talk about Ivan the Terrible and his use of force and fear, and then compare him with Peter the Great, who is really looking more to use his control to improve Russia, not make people fear him quite so much. We'll talk about England and a situation where an absolute ruler goes maybe a little bit too far and a war breaks out, and the English Civil War ends with when people push back against an absolute ruler. And you can kind of tell from this picture, it does not end well for Charles I. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about Japan. I think talking about Japan is interesting here because it's an entirely different part of the world, about as far as you can get from Europe. And yet they're doing things very similarly, and there are a lot of overlapping ideas when it comes to absolute rulers and people who have total control over the country. So I really like that one. There was a project on the drawing board, but ends up that's getting scrapped. We it didn't work out this time, but maybe next year we'll do that. So that's just the introduction to Unit 4. I hope you really focus on the ideas of absolute monarchy, divine right, and kind of this is just a setup for the rest of what we'll talk about in this unit.